Welcome to Changed, the podcast that's all about the stories that shape us, the moments that move us, and the growth that keeps us evolving. I'm your host, Megan Galloway, and each week we'll dive into powerful stories of transformation. Because the truth is, change is constant, and it's what we do with it that defines who we are. So whether it's a major life shift or the subtle everyday changes that lead us to something bigger, this podcast is here to inspire, challenge, and celebrate the journey of becoming. Hello and welcome back. I am so happy to have you here. I am Megan Galloway and I'm your host. And I am absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Bobbi Wegner here with me today. She, even just in our initial conversations, I've just been absolutely blown away by the things that she's doing, by the knowledge that she has, and I cannot wait to get into it today. She is a psychologist who is also an entrepreneur. She spends part of her time teaching at Harvard. In addition to that, she's the CEO of an incredible company, a coaching company called Groops, and she is all about using her psychology background to help people create more meaningful connections that help us all be better inside of work and life. And I am just absolutely thrilled to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, wow. That was quite an introduction, Megan. And I'm so happy to be here and love your work. And I just can't wait for this conversation.
Me too. Me too. All right. Well, let's just dive right into it. So we're going to get a little personal for a second. And I would just love this podcast is all about change. So what are the moments that change who we are as a human being on some sort of like a deep level? So I would love to hear from you. What is a defining moment that has changed you the most as a person?
Yeah, I thought about this question, and there's a few things that, I think really kind of shape who I am as a person. But when I think about sort of like pre and post and where I was and where I am, one of the biggest ones, which I didn't even know it was like in it exactly until like looking back. So when I was 21, my dad died, and he had a sort of random lung disease that came about, and I just wasn't expecting him to die. Like I had not lost anyone super close to me yet. I didn't even know that's really kind of like the path that he was on. And then he ended up dying in January of 2001. And I came home from college, maybe in October or November, went to Trinity College down in Hartford, drove back to Boston. I think it would have been like my birthday or something. And he sat me down in his office and he said, like, Bobbi, I know I'm not going to make it to the spring. And it was like, I remember feeling just like the world shift underneath me. And he ended up passing away shortly after New Year's. And it was just such an intense time. And I had just left to study abroad in England, and I came back. I'd made it home just in time to be with him when he passed. And it was the first time I was with someone when they died. It was just like this sort of big moment that was sort of thrust into my life when I was a junior in college, really without a lot of expectation. And so it forced me to very quickly be like, what am I doing here? If I go back to England, how long do I stay? What do I even do? And for me, my dad was the person who did like, he was just kind of almost like the ground I walked on. He did all the things, just like, kind of paid for college, made sure stuff was sort of in a line. When I needed something, he would just do it. And I just didn't have to think a lot, which was, I appreciate, super privileged position. But I just knew that he was there to support me. So when he died, I was like, great, what do I do now? Like, aside from the loss, I was like, does my mom know, like, how to pay for stuff? And does my mom and not even the tangible tactical stuff, just like, how do I navigate life without this person who's really been like leading and guiding, and I lost that person. So it really forced me to figure things out for my own in a lot of ways. And that is like the biggest learning for me, that is sort of like increasing self-efficacy. I remember buying my first car and
And
going to meet some guy in Grand Central Station and calling my brother-in-law ahead of time to be like, how do I even like assess a car? Is this a good car or a bad car? And just like things like that. But it was just trying to figure out all the parts of life that it's really helpful to have a parent to kind of navigate with you.
first of all, thank you for sharing. my dad is my person too, and he's had a lot of health issues the last year, and there's a lot that goes along with that emotionally as you're kind of, to your point, like, managing the grief that comes alongside, figuring out, what it means to lose someone who's so important to you. And then, I mean, the parts that you're talking about here of you were becoming a different person in the ways in which you had to approach the world. You had a huge influx, it sounds like, in responsibilities and problem solving and figuring out what you needed your life to look like after that. Tell me a little bit more about, like, how did you adapt in that moment when all of a sudden you had like all of these other things and the person that you would normally go to for those things, wasn't there in that moment anymore? How did you adapt to that?
Yeah, I think it's like and just sort of the other side, being on the other side of the coach, I guess, so to speak, at times is that it's like you don't even know what you're doing in the moment, you just, like, do it. I needed a car, so I started researching cars, and I start reaching out to all the people that I think are smart and know more than I do and just picking their brains, and I think there's actually so much parallel. I find myself kind of looking back at that time now as I'm in startup, just kind of in this landscape that's unknown and not really one right way, but also with a lot of people who are kind and generous and willing to kind of like share their own knowledge sets and wisdom. But at the end of the day, you just have to make a move and try something and probably screw up a little bit along the way. And I think I'm not a super fearful person. Like I'm willing to just like give it a go and see what happens. And so I think that carried me a long way to being like, well, I'll just try. And then I think on the other side of it, people generally are pretty supportive when you're putting effort in to try something new. So then it ends up becoming this like new landscape where I'm going out into the world and kind of negotiating or navigating on my own. But also the world was like relatively, I'm lucky enough it was relatively generous back to me. So then you start building a little self-efficacy, feeling like you can do it. I start internalizing this idea that like I'll be okay even when like the worst thing that could have happened in my mind happened. I also learned like life goes on and it's still beautiful and there's lots of greatness and the stories just continuing to unfold and this was just the ending of one little chapter. But there's like many, many other chapters that are really exciting and promising and just lots of like goodness. And I've lost other significant people since then, like my sister and my brother-in-law, and my mom just passed away, so it's like loss is not unfamiliar to me, but I think really going through that first big loss helped me realize, like, things are okay, even when you kind of lose the biggest things or the biggest people, like, there's so many awesome relationships and connections and parts of life that are still there.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that sometimes when I'm going through hard things in my life, one of the like talk tracks that I have in my own mind is, this is just a part of my story. This is just a
Mhm.
part of who I am. And it's out of my control, especially when there are larger, harder things that are happening. But this is just part of who I'm meant to become. Like, this is helping
Mhm.
craft this story that is going to turn into something that I can't even imagine yet. But I can't prevent it from happening. So I just have to let that change happen and embrace it as part of who I am as a human being.
Yeah, I love that, and I have a similar type of, like, kinda talk track is, like, the only constants change. It's like, it's just inevitable, So and in psychology, there's this idea or this, like, visual that it's almost like a tidal wave that's coming, and if you try to hold it back and resist, like, it's just painful, and you're gonna get thrown around. Like, it's better to just, like, roll with it and accept it in some ways and kind of ride it, but have enough awareness that you're in the wave, to, like, kind of move with it and move as you can within whatever storm or wave that you're kind of stuck in the moment.
Yeah, because I think when you get into that wave, you have to have this, like, the awareness piece is so important because you have to have more grace with yourself during that time. It's like,
Mhm.
I am going to get more bounced around than I would normally in a daily routine. And that's okay because that's what I expect for now. But I think that's when we fight it, to your point, that it just feels so much more painful because we're maybe not fully aware and choice around how we want to respond inside of that.
Yeah. And I think there's a tangible part of it too, where I'm like, okay, I know I'm in something right now. I need to be very clear about where I'm spending my energy and get super focused. It's almost like I can be sort of think one of my strengths is probably because all of this, like being in difficult situations, and in those, I almost get hyper focused on the things, like raise the awareness. What do I really need to focus on? Where do I need to spend my time? Where am I getting the most value? There's many different ways to get value in your life, but is it emotional value? Is it like, working? It could be anything, but it's like brings me a lot of clarity, and focus sharpens, which I think helps me navigate it in a probably more productive way.
Hmm. One of the things that you said as well was that when that moment happened, you recognized that there were all of these other people that were part of your community that were different connections that you started to seek out to get their support and opinions. How do you think that moment, or has that moment, now that you reflect on it, influenced your work around connection and the work that you do in the psychology space?
Yeah, like hugely. I started to get really interested in I specialize in health psychology. So it's before mind body connection was really super understood or mainstream. And it's really about the intersection of what we're thinking, how we're feeling, and how our social communities impact really our health and our functioning. And so I wrote a whole paper on the stages of grief and loss, and really retrospectively looked at what I thought my dad was going through, and then kind of what I was going through, and then mapped it against sort of like loss kind of paradigms. Like Kubler-Ross is the biggest one, and kind of death and dying. And it's like, wow, there's like a whole framework here that we helps us understand ourselves, because this is a universal experience. So I started to get very interested in psychology. I was already a psych major, but I started to get like very interested. Kind of knew at that point I wanted to go back to graduate school for psychology and get my doctorate. But all of it was like, I think at that point, which I've come to understand more deeply, is that like there's a lot we're hardwired for connection. We're social by nature. Relationships help us feel and function our best when we can lean into those, and we have choice in those relationships that we kind of are inviting into our life. It changes the quality of our life. And we're seeing that now more than ever. Like it's just we're living in the most disconnected time of our culture ever, but we forget that we're animals at the end of the day. We're tribal by nature. We need each other. And when you can actually like bring yourself into a group, there's a lot of safety, but there's also comfort and protection in all these different ways when you can kind of find your people and
Mm.
then share on top of it. Like it's not just being with people, it's actually emotionally connecting too.
Yeah, on that deeper level. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the Surgeon General has been talking about this for the last couple of years, and I think there was already a trend in that direction of becoming more disconnected, and then the pandemic definitely exacerbated that situation. And so, Vivek Murthy has published a whole bunch of great work around that disconnection. And at the same time, we know that the rate of change is also continuing to accelerate. We have so many massive disruptors inside of our day to day with the rise of AI and wearable technology. And there's so many different things that are just so rapidly changing. Do you think those two are correlated in some way to each other through the research and the things that you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think technology in a lot of ways can facilitate connection, but it can also create these gigantic gaps too. I mean, we're seeing the impact, even looking at kind of generational differences in communication and showing up in kind of real life versus in virtual. And the way I think about this is like connection is a human problem or a human thing. You cannot solve, human connection through technology alone. Technology can enable connection, but it really has to be driven by people. There's a lot that goes on in interaction between people that technology can enable or help put people in similar spaces, but there's a lot of work that has to be done on like kind of like the human front to really deepen connection. And what I mean by that is like there's a lot of like connection tools where it's like, hey, just, you can get feedback maybe on how you're showing up for people or something, but there's a lot of dynamic interrelational things that impact how you feel and how I feel. And so somebody needs to help people create more opportunity for that. And that's really what we're trying to do now. So we're using tech to like scale a group connection platform at work, but we're never, and investors hate this, but like we're never going to have a human outside of the room. Like, we're just never gonna do that because we see the best outcomes when you have a human expert in psychology facilitating deeper connection within a group. and we can use technology to understand ourselves better, to communicate in between groups. But the actual relationship building has to be driven by a human.
Yeah, it has to be human to human inside of that space.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot of fear around a lot of the changes that are happening, right? Like, I think that there are a lot of folks, even you and I met at a conference in, Las Vegas called Transform, and one of the hot topics there was, what does AI mean for the HR industry overall, and what changes are going to be happening? And a lot of the questions that came from the audience were related to, what does this mean for jobs? And, are roles going to be eliminated? And I think that there's a lot of fear when change is on the
Mhm.
horizon. We know it's coming, but we don't necessarily know exactly what it's going to be mean. There's a lot of ambiguity. So, if someone listening to this is feeling that kind of fear around the changes that are coming and or are feeling disconnected and fear of all of the changes that are coming, what would you recommend to them? Like, what advice would you give to someone that's standing on a cliff of impending change, ambiguity, and disconnection?
Yeah. So systems seek homeostasis. So whether it's an individual or it's a team or it's an organization or it's a government or it's but systems seek homeostasis. Like we sort of this is just like the pattern of groups. So we can have periods of change and then we might sort of right itself. But generally speaking, we hang around sort of like the median, right? Like if we step back and look, so the way I think about change is like even when big things happen that I really don't like, like in particular some elected officials or it's like okay, well systems generally mostly right themselves if we kind of like interject and push and do our part, but also trust that systems can kind of like come back around in some way. That brings me a lot of faith. The other thing is when I feel that fear myself, I am like, "Well, that's normal," right? Like, and then I accuse me to be like, "What do I actually want here? And then what's my role to affect the change?" Because systems seek homeostasis, I might have to be the one who's really gonna drive this thing. It's gonna create a lot of work for me, but if it's worth it, I'll do it. So I use the fear as a cue that, like, we're resisting something here, and then it gives me the choice, which direction do I wanna go? Do I wanna double down and push hard, or do I wanna kind of, like, step back? And is it worth it?
Hmm. When I love that you're pulling in, I'm a big fan of Susan David. She
Oh,
had her
yeah.
work around emotional agility. I think is super interesting that emotions are data points that help us understand how we want to move forward, but our emotions are not us. They're just data inputs to tell us where we want to go. So I love that you're kind of using that framing of fear is a data input that's telling you to
Mhm.
check in with yourself, to notice what you need, but then also to help inform your decision making for the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very CBT kind of perspective, but I use this with companies and organizations in all systems. There's like thoughts, there's feelings, and there's behaviors. So it's like there's a cognitive thing going on. Like, what are we thinking here? And then it's like, what am I feeling? And then what am I doing? So fear is a feeling. You cannot just will away your feelings. So when people are like, just chill, relax, it's like that's useless because that's not how this works. But I can change the way I'm thinking about it. So, it helps me when I feel that fear to, like, cue into the thoughts. How do I wanna think about this in a different way? And then also what I wanna do in response to it. Because I have choice in how I think and what I do, not necessarily in the feeling, which is more of an outcome.
That's super helpful. Well, let's take a little bit of a different route for a second. What is one thing that you hope never changes about who you are as a human being?
One thing I hope never changes, I guess there are a couple things I really hold tight. I do feel like I can roll with a lot of things. I had a supervisor once say she used the word unflappable. And I was like, well, A, that's a cool word. I'd never heard it before. I think I had to like go Google it. But I do take things in stride. Like I'm like, okay, I see. If we're going into like Gallup Strength Finder, my number one strength is like strategic, which sounds a little transactional and weird. But I really think it is like there's not one path to the end. So when I can see multiple paths, like it allows me not to totally get thrown off kilter. And I really like that. And I think to tie it back to the beginning, like I think losing my dad, having like kind of the worst thing happen in my mind at that moment allowed me to be like, even when the worst thing happens, it's still okay. And I just have to see the paths and the choice, and then I can navigate.
I feel like the unflappable Dr. Bobbi Wegner is like a TV show waiting to happen.
I'm picturing some kind of like bright cape.
Yes, I totally see it.
Oh my gosh, you're so
Saving the
funny.
world from change. That is so good. Yeah, I think one of the things that I hope someone listening to this is taking away is no matter what they're going through, because everyone has hard stuff. Like every single one of us goes through, and it feels like the older you get, the harder things feel. But just because
Yeah.
there's the scope of responsibility and of context just grows as you do. And my hope is for anyone listening to this that they can have a little bit of your unflappability, if that's a word. I might have just made it up to be able to take that and say, whatever I'm going through, there is a path on the other side and I'm going to figure it out and there could be multiple paths and I get to choose what's going to be best given what I know and even if the worst happens, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, and like think of it as an opportunity too. I supervise kind of like younger psychologists or do a lot of kind of training in this
Yep.
field. And I'm like, we feel this pressure, especially I think our younger kind of generation, to have it all figured out or to have the straight path. And the reality is, I'm like, listen, just what direction are you heading in, and what's your best move in this moment? So you can kind of map against a larger goal, but think about it more as a lily pad, and it just gives you freedom and flexibility to pivot and to move in a different way that I think is more productive and has a lot of value in terms of not creating like undue anxiety because you just cannot see that far in the future, you
Yeah,
know?
and it's paralyzing when you try to say because I'm like you, so I have strategic in my top 5 strengths finders,
Oh,
and I
there's
also have so strategic, futurist, and ideation are top are
amazing.
my top 3. Learner, and then I'm forgetting my last one right in a second, but when I'm thinking about those 3 things, a lot of times what my brain does is I hyper accelerate into that futuristic part of things, and I see all of these potential options, and sometimes it's beautiful because it means that I can oh, achiever is my number 1. So, I,
Mm.
see the future and then I go make it real, and it's great. But when my futurist goes into hyperdrive and I see way too far into the future or I feel like I have to have it figured out too many steps in advance, then the harder it is to establish just the next best step because I feel so overwhelmed by the possibilities that could be, and so I don't know how I got on the tangent, but I just absolutely love that you said that because I do think that so many people do feel the pressure of having to have things figured out, and in reality, all of us are doing no matter what their title is or what they're doing inside of their day job, everyone's just trying to figure it out the best they can, and no one really has the answers.
Yeah, and the context change too. We can have the best laid plan, but the context around us can change. I'm thinking too with the strength finders, I think we overlap on like 4 of them. I can't remember. I was trying to think. It's like strategic communication, woo, achiever, and then there's some 5th one I can't remember
Yeah,
either.
we do have a lot of overlap.
And did you know I just found out this weekend you can get like a certification like being a futurist. Did you know this? There's
What?
like yeah, no, I met this really cool woman. She runs this like global networking, co-working company. And she has like a certification being a futurist, which is sort of mapping out probabilities of things in the future and kind of like peeking into the future a little bit. So I'm curious about learning more about this. But if it's a strength, you might want to check it out.
I love that. Well, and the other thing that I listened to recently that if you're listening to this could be an interesting thing to check out is Brene Brown recently in her podcast had a really phenomenal speaker, Amy Webb. She has like the most attended South by Southwest session every
Ooh,
year. And basically what she does is unveil what her team, she's a team that that's what they do is they try to map out potential future paths and the probabilities of those
super
paths.
cool.
And she unveils that at South by Southwest every year. So definitely an episode to check
Wow.
out. It
I'm
was really
definitely going
good.
to go to that. And there's a book I just read too by Mike Maples called Pattern Breakers. And it's really like a kind of a startup-y type book. We didn't talk a lot about it today, but in motivation, and we're talking about thinking about helping people change, like painting a very clear visual picture. So from looking from the motivational interviewing lens, which is really a coaching kind of counseling type stance, a big part of your job as a coach is to help the person paint like a very clear picture of what the future is, because it's much easier to move towards something that you can really visualize. And so I've known this from a psychology lens and kind of work I do with people. But Mike Maples and his co-author put it in more of a startup landscape and technology landscape. And it's like not rocket science. It just clicked for me. which is really like, how can you spend a lot of time living in a future state and building now, like what you think the future problems will be, and getting kind of a jump start and visualizing and engaging with it in this really kind of personal way. And so I was like, oh, that's totally true. That's what we do in psychology too. Like, how do we apply this across different domains, basically?
So cool. So cool. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. This has been an absolute treat. Are you ready for the speed round?
Let's do it.
All right. What is one thing that you used to hate, but now you love?
What I used to hate, but I now to love scallops. So I'm a New Englander. I really should love all seafood. I love shellfish. Used to think scallops were gross. Now I love them.
I love that. That's a great answer. What is one book or movie that totally changed your perspective?
I'm gonna say Pattern Breakers. This is like a little redundant, but I just read it. And it's just thinking about it just gave me a reframe on like building a startup, sort of like what am I orienting on? How does it change like the way I'm even speaking about groups versus now versus a future? Because we can very much get positions just sort of like a coaching platform, but then it's hard to differentiate versus no, we're actually really focused on our sweet spot is helping teams deepen connection. So
Mm,
just leaning into that language.
love that. What is one thing you wish you could change about our world right now?
Oh, there's a lot. But I guess going with the theme that we're talking about here, which is really changed. Carl Rogers is like a pretty famous psychologist, and he's a humanistic psychologist. And the belief in motivational interviewing and in his, kind of Rogerian theory is that change really happens when in the context of unconditional positive regard. So it means like there's nothing you could do to make you sort of me love you less as a human. It's not about you could have like behaviors we would all deem terrible, but like I see you fully as a human and I'm like kind of love you at that level. And I just think I wish all of us could practice that more rather than trying to convince each other that we're right,
Mm,
and just to translate that into tactical tips, ask 2 questions, what or how, questions before you give any advice or counter argue anything, but just to deepen curiosity and kind of try to get to more connection at the root of it.
I love that. I worked with a startup at one point that it was a pharmaceutical company, and I worked with their executive team. And one of the things that they decided as their team norms that they wanted to have was when they disagreed on something, before they could state their own opinion, they had to reflect back what they heard the other person saying first. And it's changed everything for them. And I think if more people did that, even inside of, our society, politics, corporate, wherever you apply that, that would change a lot of things for us. So that's a good answer.
Absolutely. Yeah, that comes from actually part of that could come from motivational interviewing, which is oars. Ask open-ended questions, make affirmative statements, reflect back what you're saying, summarize. So it's like a construct we can like practice.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was, like I said, such a treat to have you on. If people want to learn more about groups or the work that you're doing, can you tell us where they can find more information?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. So I'm very accessible. You can go to LinkedIn. It's Bobbi, Bobbi, Wegner with an E. So Wegner, or Groups, which is joingroups.com. And Groups has 2 O's.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much for being here and really appreciate all the wisdom you shared today.
Oh, thanks, Megan.
Thank you so much for joining me today on Changed. I hope this story sparks something in you, maybe a reminder of your own growth or a new perspective on where you're headed. Remember, change doesn't have to be something that you're scared of. It's an opportunity to become more of who we're meant to be. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. Your story is unfolding and we can't wait to see where it takes you. Until next time.